Kyra, welcome to the show. Great to have you here.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
So let's talk about social media addiction. Why is it about to get worse?
We have no evolution in our brains that helps us to handle the rate of iteration that AI is going to produce and unleash on our brains. And that means that whatever being is slower to iterate is going to be controlled by the being that can iterate the fastest. Because there's a mechanism in our brain that we're just starting to characterize in research sciences that turns out to be the sort of the hook, if you will, of our behavior, of whether we will do something and whether we're not. And so my whole thing is, how can we as humans learn about our brains so that we don't become susceptible to something that's going to be way beyond what we could possibly track and conceive of? We're going to have to use a different method, a different approach to keep our sovereignty and keep our intellectual and creative freedom.
Absolutely. What interested you in this work and what is your mission?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I started out in healthcare. I was a doctor, and then I decided that being a doctor was mostly being a prescriber, writing prescriptions instead of like changing behavior. And I was much more attracted to behavior and why it did and didn't happen, and why patients would come and be like, "Yeah, I know I promised to do all these things the last time, but didn't do them." That's if they even had the guts to show up and say that to the clinician. A lot of people get overwhelmed by feeling like a failure when they tell another human being that they're going to do something. And then just tracking that, I tried all of the standard approaches, goals, tracking, steps, competitions, leaderboards, carrots and sticks, paying people to do things. I mean, just every trick in the book, and got into behavioral science, which then led me to neuroscience, because I feel like sometimes behavioral science, by function of the fact that most studies are done on college students, at least in the US. A lot of science is done on college students, which are not always generalizable to older populations, diverse populations, global populations. And so neuroscience, I feel like, is the great leveler. It's the great, equalizer, that if I can find what the brain is doing, then I can kind of use first principles from there and build out, a really strong hypothesis about what actually is happening on the behavioral level. So that's how I got into it, just following the question, like, why do people, behave the way they behave?
Yeah, absolutely. What an interesting career evolution. And what in particular sparked your interest in the areas of social media, digital technology?
Yeah, so I went to, when I was getting into behavior design, which is like designing for behaviors, and in my case, health behaviors. The lab I was in at Stanford University we were a part of a panel where I represented the lab. And on this panel, we had this whole conversation around mental health and social media and design. And Facebook had been in the field for about 5 years, and Google was doing all kinds of things, applying behavioral science to get more engagement, to get more, addictive behaviors to happen. And one of my grad students in the lab, who was working with me on a project, we did this study using really sophisticated emotional machinery, and found that the main emotion that drives people to open their app, any app, is just a little bit of anxiety. And that fascinated me. And so if you kind of take that early primitive tools that social media companies were using, and then you get to right now, I mean, that's just like an order of magnitude or two beyond. And I remember having a conversation on that panel that, these things are likely causing anxiety and depression at a massive scale. And so we saw it from the beginning. And so did, all these social media companies, and they just doubled down because their incentives are to keep you hooked on their product, to keep you coming back, to fan the flames of your FOMO, and your anxiety, because FOMO is basically a form of anxiety.
Mm. So we're basically microdosing anxiety, and what we practice is what we become, which could explain why young people are experiencing these, epidemic levels of anxiety. It's really interesting. And how do they trigger that little rush of anxiety? Is it through the push notifications? How do
Yeah.
they get us to keep coming back?
Yeah. So, addiction medicine is sort of like the model of addiction is shifting very quickly. In the past, there was this idea of a dopamine loop that set up a habit loop, right? So it's like the animal does something, gets a reward, and then that feels good, releases dopamine, and the animal wants to do it again.
Mhm.
Then the second generation thinking was, oh, it's the anticipation of the reward that releases the dopamine. Once you get to the reward, whether it's the food or the vacation or whatever, or the money, whatever it is, then the dopamine drops and you kind of feel bad. And that kind of co-rose with an observation in addiction, people who work in addiction medicine, that a lot of addicts are saying, I don't get high, to feel pleasure. I get high to feel normal. So that's super intriguing. And the bridge between these two observations is that there's a newly characterized area called the habenula in our brain.
Hello, it's Brad Hook here, and I'm delighted to share my new book, Start with Values. It is a guide to help you discover what matters most and then bring those core values to life through tools such as micro habits. It helps you make clearer decisions through the decision making guide. It helps you to activate your values in conversations, particularly those courageous conversations where you need to assert yourself. And it helps you explore some potential shared values, such as nature stewardship, to help us all look after this planet that we call home. Inside, you'll find thought experiments, you'll find worksheets, you'll find action plans, and lots more. If you are interested in reducing your stress and building a life that's meaningful and purposeful, get your copy now. They're available on Amazon, both as a paperback book, such as this, and in Kindle format. So if you have some feedback, please log it in the reviews. I'd love to hear your experience of bringing your values to life. This approach has helped hundreds of thousands of people around the world, and it's now ready for you. Get your copy.
Two pea size in the very center. And basically what they do is they respond to failure from the past, present, or future. And so anxiety is a fear of failing, whether it's social anxiety or professional anxiety or anxiety. It's a fear that it's not going to work out for you. And so with the apps, what was happening is that, Facebook kind of bored itself. In the early days, it was a bunch of people just kind of making up stuff. Nobody really knew how to be interesting on social media. And that skill hadn't sort of been developed with anybody yet. And so then they turned on the news channels, because what the news channels did is it gave an evergreen stimulus of, you can never be fully at the end of this scroll.
Yes.
And that therefore was born doom scrolling. That the endless scroll was kind of like an advance in that world. And that connects up to our addictive, our habenula, which is very connected to addiction. We'll talk about that in a second. But our habenula looking and looking and looking to make sure we're safe, to make sure we're not failing, to make sure there's nothing out there that's nobody's talking bad about us or that kind of thing. And that hooked us. And we'll talk about the biochemistry of like positives and negatives here in a second. But
so the habenula is related to hypervigilance in a way. It's that feeling of, I just need to keep scanning my environment in order to hopefully at some point feel safe.
That's right. That's right. And it's because it is the source of negativity bias in behavioral science, that like nothing's going to work out for me, pessimism, that's the worst possible thing. And for people who have had, unfortunately, more difficult lives, trauma, poverty, food scarcity, any of those kinds of things, the habenula is much more hyperactive. It's much more sensitive, I should say, where, something might trigger that person's habenula that would be no big deal for, I don't know your background, but like for somebody else. Right. And so it is a losing game, because when your habenula is on, it is a very itchy, like you want to crawl out of your skin kind of, but you don't, it's a sensation that it's not like stubbing your toe where you really can place it. You can't place where it's coming from. And so it's this kind of itchy, scratchy part. And more times than not, if you have availability to addictive substances, you will do anything you can to kind of pop a pill, so to speak, look at your phone, consume something else, and you are in the immediate doing a little dopamine relief to try to feel normal again because you feel bad.
Hey, Brad here. Would you believe that around 70% of the people who watch this podcast have not yet subscribed? It would mean the world to us if you click that subscribe button on whichever platform you use so that we can stay connected with you and you'll receive notifications when we add new episodes. We really appreciate you coming and connecting with us and being part of our community. So all the best.
But the punishment comes because the habenula is like, oh yeah, you're going to try to suppress me. I'm going to double down and I'm going to squash your dopamine. I'm going to squash your serotonin, because the habenula is basically like the brake pedal on your car. If the gas pedal was your dopamine of like, go, 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 motivated, the habenula is like, pump the brakes, man. No, we can't do that. Stop, full stop, quit trying, all of that stuff. And so that's how it while we are withdrawing, this area of our brain is bubbling up. It is the source of withdrawal symptoms, withdrawal suffering, cravings.
So what we're seeking is a temporary relief from the suffering, which comes in some way from this overactive habenula.
Mm-hmm.
And we try and dim that using whatever is at our disposal. And that's where addiction starts to form.
Yeah, yeah. And so the second round, then the first one might be like a temporary relief. The second one is you're just trying to get back to normal. You're trying to get back to 0 point. But the habenula in behavioral economics, loss is twice as powerful as gain. And so we start falling down the number line into the negative space. Every time we reach for something addictive, we then get twice the amount of pain in withdrawal symptoms. And then we're trying to use again, we get twice the amount. So it's a losing proposition. And that's our bioengineering, and we have to be able to hack that. What
is dopamine burnout?
Do you mean like overload, like, the opposite of fasting? Yeah, I think, it's an idea that if you are so chasing after the dopamine with your behavior, trying to crawl out of this pit of suffering that the habenula has imposed upon you from multiple cycles of this, that simply just stopping craving, like stop, if you can just kind of bear through the wave of intensity of the withdrawal symptoms from your last, binge, that you would have a little more availability to be able to control that because it's not so strong. The cravings are not as strong.
Very interesting. Okay. So let's talk AI in particular, because this is a new technology that's been unleashed and I can already see it's changing everything, as I'm sure you can too. I mean, I read posts and you can almost instantly tell which ones are AI generated, comments that are AI generated. How will AI personalize manipulation in real time? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a positive story and a negative story there. So I'll go for the negative first. Mm-hmm. So the negative story is that it can so easily mirror back. Like if I'm talking to somebody and they've got their hand on their face and I do that too, like that's been shown to create, synchrony between me and the other person. Mm. So it can do something like that, like the mimicry, where we start to, and we're already in these echo chambers. I mean, there's a gendered one, where men are going down one tube, women are going down the other, and then there's generational, where each generation has its own little favorite shows and its favorite whatever. Mm-hmm. But even those people are being separated further into these little, tubules, so everybody's in a capillary of their own making based on this thing that is predicting what you'll want next, or dangling things in front of you that you can use as a drug to shut your habenula up, because your habenula is the one alarm system that's going off saying like, we're failing at like living in this life. We're in this tunnel. We're in this virtual world that's kind of collapsing on itself. And that's the positive, because I do think that the AI does not have access to one area of our brain that we do, which is our intrinsic memory systems, our implicit memory systems, where everything that ever happens to you is somehow recorded, forms patterns that are at first unconscious, then slightly subconscious, might take the form of a dream, might take the form of a metaphor, and then boom, it pops into your consciousness when it's needed to help your life, ideally. And so as long as we aren't too far gone on the negative side in that echo chamber, we can hear ourselves and we can see that we're in an echo chamber. Then, and the thing that remains to be seen, because it's so new, AI, is how long certain people need to go into this echo chamber before they can tell that they're in one, before they can tell that they're in this illusory reality.
Or when that echo chamber actually starts to become part of the embedded kind of sphere of memories, so that you don't really differentiate what actually happened in the real world from what's going on when you're down these tubules. That's going to be quite interesting. When AI starts to generate content for us in real time and we're consuming it. For example, I pick up my phone, I open YouTube, a habit that I'm really trying to reduce, but it's a habit that's unfortunately crept into my life. Not all the time. I use it deliberately most of the time, but often it starts with YouTube shorts, which are designed to trigger strong emotional responses. And it's usually highly emotive content. What should we do about that? How would you recommend we become more deliberate about using these tools?
I think the first thing is to realize how addictive they are. You know, like we wouldn't mess around with methamphetamine in this way.
No.
You know, like you wouldn't say, you know, I'm just going to lightly do meth today. Do a couple
Give it
hits
a
of
try.
meth.
Yeah.
I'm going to
Yeah.
get it in before my next recording. You know, like you wouldn't do that, right?
Yeah.
So I think the strength is a bit that needs to be. We need to be sober about that, and especially I think the conversation around that's going to come with the kids first, because we may not be able to see it in ourselves, or we may kind of go down with the ship ourselves, but almost everybody I know really cares about what's happening to their kids' brains.
Definitely.
And so we're going to be worried about that. We're going to regulate that. We're going to like say, hey, that's not okay for that. And I don't know, there's much more clever people than me working on policies that hopefully will make some headway to kind of give the kids some form of like frontal brain activity before they hit the meth, you know, on that side. So yeah, I think seriousness around the dosing, around the severity of the addiction quality. And then we haven't gotten addiction recovery very right for everyone. There's a small segment who really get a lot out of AA, NA, those kinds of models, the 12-step models. And, you know, God bless them for that. And I really think that it has to be in community that we heal together.
Yeah.
Because it is happening. Part of our illness is our separation, is being in these tubules and not having contact with each other. And I am very aware, because I'm also, you know, recovery from YouTube addiction. And I had all kinds of, you know, stories in my head about my own merits of learning, because I watch gardening videos and permaculture. I'm like, oh, well, this is good for me or whatever. But I started tracking it. And every single time that I went to reach for YouTube, there was a boredom or a desire, more importantly, a missing of my children, because they don't live near me. And that loneliness of not being able to connect with my kids. And that's what was driving my use. So I think changing the conversation around like this very neuroscience based, you know, like what is happening with your habenula? What's happening with my habenula? Because when the habenula is on, you're going to reach for YouTube.
That is really interesting. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And the connection piece is so important because, you know, I went to a pub a few weekends ago, a family kind of outdoor space, and it was amazing seeing people from every generation. There were 2-year-olds crawling around. There were 5-year-olds running around. There were older kids, teenagers, parents, grandparents, all the way through, sitting in the sunshine talking. And I think we need more of that because the environment was so nourishing, even just being
Yes.
amidst that. We
Yeah.
need to break down some of these silos that have started to be created. I mean, between men and women and between, the Gen Z and Gen Y. This is silly. Why do we need these barriers? We're just humans.
Yeah. I mean, that's another area where we're being hacked by AI and these algorithms, which is that we are very susceptible to tribalism and being pitted against each other and in group and out group. Like our very strongest hormone in our whole body is oxytocin. And it's the most pervasive. It's the most essential for life. It is the reason why, back in the 1970s, 80s, or I think 60s, 70s, where when babies weren't held in the neonatal ICU, they would die because there's no oxytocin to keep them alive. It keeps all of your systems going, your gut, your heart, your brain, everything is run by oxytocin. So we are dependent on this. And I believe that what we're creating with AI and these technologies is oxytocin deficiency syndromes, where people are looking for oxytocin in conspiracy theories, in porn, in online gaming groups, in these virtual wormholes that really give them almost like junk food oxytocin, but not full nutrition value oxytocin, like what you were describing in that
Mm-hmm.
outdoor scene with all those beautiful people.
Yeah, yeah. I worry about kids. I've got a 10-year-old daughter. She'll be 11 soon. We've managed
Oh,
to help her avoid becoming addicted to devices. Every now and then she picks up an iPad and she's like, would it be okay if I just look up some pictures to draw? So we've managed to do that somehow.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
How long should we delay it? I see Australia has brought in a law that under 16-year-olds can't access certain social media platforms, but they're just using VPNs. Or some are.
I know.
What are your thoughts about
Turn the
delaying
kids
that?
into turn the kids into hackers
Yeah, exactly. I mean, anything that
to get to the
prohibition kind of creates its own industries, right? So if you say you're not using it, so and then the issue becomes, I see that some of her friends already have access. Some of them, she's like, oh, my friends, a few of
Yes,
them
I was just going to
have
ask you that.
Messenger, and they're messaging
Yep.
each other using their parents' phones. Could I get
Mm-hmm.
it? Why do you need to? You can talk to them at school. I don't think you need to be on hyper alert for potential messages from your friends.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's this adapting to an environment where some have this thing and some don't, and some are already addicted to TikTok, and it's really sad. I mean, when you see an 11-year-old who can't stop watching TikTok videos, where does
Mm-hmm.
that go? So any tips for
Mm-hmm.
parents out there who might be navigating this kind of transition?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to get worse before it gets better, is my prediction, because the US is a little further into the addiction of the 11-year-olds than what I'm hearing you describe. Like the fact that at least you can do that. That is the capture mechanism for your daughter. Is all of her friends will have something,
Yeah.
and you just, as a parent, you just can't not let her participate in it, and you're setting her up into something that is highly addictive. And so the way to really counterbalance that you do have control over as a parent is to team up with other parents as much as you can and
Mhm.
form conversation groups around this. Part of it's the shyness of the parents, not feeling like they have the right to intervene against these multinational predatory, brain predatory, if somebody was going after your daughter's brain with anything else, you'd get really fierce about it as a parent. So
Definitely.
I think it's just that, like, we might feel guilty because we're also using it. I don't use anything but YouTube at this point. But we might feel guilty or like we're being a hypocrite or whatever. I know there's a lot of parents that feel guilty about just kind of getting lost in their phone while their kid, who doesn't have a phone yet because they're younger, like your daughter, are just looking at the side of their face. Like that's a whole new kind of version of child neglect that we haven't really grappled with the psychology of that yet and what that's doing to our young people.
It just didn't exist when I was growing up. Of course, I mean, people were either telling you to be quiet and go and play outside, or interacting with you directly. Or I suppose there were moments when Granddad might be reading the newspaper and he's like, "Oh, just leave me for a little while." But it was
Mhm.
intentional. It was quite a deliberate thing. It wasn't just filling the space.
Yeah. And
Mm.
and it didn't just scroll endlessly where you
Well,
didn't know when you'd get grandpa back, right? Like there was a finiteness to
yeah, he
the
never got
paper.
to the end and then started again. That's
Yeah,
for
or
sure.
get another one and just immediately start binging it.
Yeah, that's that is interesting. Yeah, it is an interesting time to parent, and really, you don't want to overdo it in terms of coddling them and blocking out potential distractions, because they're going to go to someone's house at some point in time and they will fire up a web browser and they'll see stuff that I don't want her to see.
Yeah.
I accept that that's going to happen at some point, but it's just building the habits of enjoying the real world. I think is one of the key areas, like finding flow state in the real world and connection in community events. I personally started running some more community events. I used to do just corporate
Oh,
workshops,
wonderful.
but even if it's just the school community and I do it for free, it's an opportunity for us all to nourish ourselves with that connection. And I didn't realize that the oxytocin piece was part of that, but it is what I'm craving.
It's absolutely what you mean. I'm so glad to hear that you're doing that. We need more people like you who are willing, who have that skill to bring people together and make things fun. There's a person on my team who, our product guy, who it brought together like hundreds of families at the end of his religious fasting period of Ramadan, and they had this family night where everybody of all ages gets together and they stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning playing soccer and different other kinds of sports and games and stuff like that. And it's good, clean fun. And the kids are just like bonkers because they're so excited to be so up so late and stuff like that. But we have to really design our next generation of in-person things that make it safe, that lower the barrier of failure, because as things have become more and more impersonal, the chances of failing socially go up because no one knows you. If you go to a party and no one knows you, you just don't feel like you belong. Your habenula goes off. You don't feel like going to parties anymore. So
Mm-hmm.
we have to get good at signaling to each other like, hey, you can't fail here. You cannot do this wrong.
Yeah.
And finding ways to shut off their shame, shut off their self-consciousness, like designing it where you come in the front door and you are assigned to a particular thing instead of having to find a lunch table that people will accept you and then nervously introducing yourself, like setting that up as requisite for everybody so that everybody's on the same level. And like just the exhale that they would get from that.
Yes. I went to, my partner is Russian, and we went to a Russian community event a few years ago. And what I loved about it was you walk in and you're told what to do. And so there's no
Yes.
ambiguity. It's just
Right. Right.
you go here and then you have to go there and try that food. And then you sit down and we're having this show and I don't speak a word of Russian, so I had no idea what was going on. But the food was nice and the people were smiley and friendly, which again, you wouldn't know that there are nice Russian people if you only read the news or
Everybody's
algorithm.
nice up close. Like,
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
worked with prisoners for about 10 years
Yeah.
during medical school and afterwards. These were young people who were chronic violent offenders and helping them come back in the community. And this was like my first foray into like really heavy duty behavior change. And I just never met anybody who didn't have a heart. They all do. Even the most hardened, injured person on the planet, unless they have like literally a wiring issue, where they're sociopathic or
Yeah.
that they just cannot access what we normally do. There's a malfunction there, like a serious malfunction, but that's not what's wrong with most people. That
No.
most people are just need an opportunity.
Yeah, that's what I found with the surf therapy program down here where I live. They get young men who've been in the prison system at young Maori men,
Mm.
and can be quite intimidating sitting in front of a room. You know, they're big if you think of like the All Blacks rugby team, and they're all so anxious. That's what usually got them into trouble, is that they have
Mhm.
trouble focusing, they're anxious, and they just find themselves on a bad path. And the next thing you know, they've robbed a shop or they've done something that they really regret. Without fail, they were all beautiful people.
Yeah. And if we link that back to the habenula, right? Like, so that young man has a very twitchy habenula because he has had shock and trauma in his past, and maybe racism and various other encounters that cause him to feel particularly like a failure. And I say failure, but failure is like a family of emotions: disappointment, discouragement, helpless, powerless, demoralization. Those are all versions of what I'm talking about. And so you have this brain that's been just pelted with all these, you're a failure, you're not good enough, all these things. And it's programmed like that. And then once you have a really super triggery habenula, you have, on the surface, you'll see that somebody's a lot more impulsive, a lot more attention deficit. Like, it's a jumpy brain. And there's hope. I mean, there's hope. The brain is neuroplastic. And one of the weird things that I found in the research is that they did this study on people who had do you have gastric sleeve surgery for bariatric
Yep.
surgery there?
Yeah.
So they did like these bariatric surgeries on people, and they just looked at their brains, like, what's the brain going to do after this? And so they lost a bunch of weight because of the surgery. But a completely unexpected result is that these people, their habenulas were shrunken down because they were so pelted and so dysfunctional, and they grew to a normal size. They grew back to a normal size. So that means that this person has fully functional brakes for where they shouldn't, act, like addiction and impulsive things. Like, they have more self-control than they used to because they've got more neural strength in that area that controls their behavior, or I should say gates the behavior of whether you do something or you don't.
How does the habenula interact with the amygdala?
It controls the amygdala. I mean, in
Okay.
a lot of ways, it has bidirectional, neural networks with the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala and things like that. But it does have a dominant role in those interactions. It's the governor of a lot of these other brain areas. And there's only one area that has been really shown to be like above habenula in the chain, and it's this new area that hasn't been really articulated with this, which is called like the SVGs. But that's just very, very new, and there's not a lot of puzzle pieces on the board to draw from yet.
So there's lots of exciting stuff in store. What about dopamine detoxes? There's a lot of YouTube videos about such things. Do you think they work?
I think that for some people it works. I think for other people, amping healthy forms of oxytocin and validation is another route for that. I mean, there's a couple sort of planes that we could work on. We can do the physical manipulation, like sticking a probe into somebody's brain and turning off your habenula. That's really like high
Hmm.
risk, right? Then there's the sort of like chemical part, like ketamine, like will go right to the habenula, soak up into the habenula and stay there for about 3 months for most people who are getting relief from their depression, because the habenula is the cause of depression and anxiety. It is the area, is the location, is the new location of causing those symptoms. So depression is a symptom, anxiety is a symptom, but the cause is failure and turning on the habenula and this cycle of addiction that ensues, right? So you could chemically disrupt that with ketamine or other psychedelics, because I think those are being investigated, and hopefully
Hmm.
those will. I know ibogaine. Have you
Yeah.
ever
Yeah.
heard of iboga? So that also goes into the habenula. and nicotine and cannabinoid receptors are all over there. So it's a really super interesting area of study that hasn't fully fleshed out, but has some super interesting, intriguing first results. Then there's the like psychological, right? Like there's the, I can meditate and I can learn to be cognitively flexible and let go of failure thoughts. I can kind of learn how to like, neutralize stories of the past that are haunting me. Um, Maybe some of my trauma can be unpacked that way. And then there's the social layer, right? Which is like, how am I within my tribe? How am I being received? Am I alone all the time? Am I isolated in my own little world of these wormholes with AI? Or am I having a vibrant social interaction that is full of ups and downs but gives me oxytocin in the most potent and natural way?
Makes so much sense. So there's inner work and there's potentially some exogenous support. You could experiment with some tools or whatever it might be as a starting point, but ideally you'd like to get to a point where you have enough self-control and connection that you are able to navigate the ups and downs of life, including maybe intentional use of some of those tools like AI and social media.
Yeah, I feel like I don't have any judgment about things. It seems like certain things only last so long, or you can only use them for so long, like SSRIs for depression. Like it's a nice sort of like keep you stable for a while, but a lot of the later studies are showing that, like the brain gets immune to it, So you're still not dealing with the root cause. Like, what is the root cause of this? And that's the sort of neurocircuitry of this failure belief.
And that's where potentially tools like psychedelics could have quite a
For some
transformative
people.
effect. For
Yeah,
some.
for some people. Yeah. I mean, and that's why it has to be, because this is the source of addiction and withdrawal symptoms for people who have used ibogaine or ketamine, and that has helped them in their recovery. And that's actually how Alcoholics Anonymous was first formed, was in combination with psychedelic assisted therapy.
Mm.
And so, and then when those medications became illegal, then just the psychosocial aspect of it continued on as these 12-step programs.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Tell us about your book. What inspired the writing of the book and what will people find inside of it?
Well, the book is the first synthesis of everything we're talking about. It's like a full rundown of the science of both how we as humans can be created by, or how can be controlled by our habenula, and how important it is to not become controlled. How important our sovereignty is as individuals. And as we go into this new AI era, that's never more important. So the book is really about like showing this system of control in the brain, and then also all of its tentacles, all of its like, the depression, the motivation control, the serotonin, the social, that it controls food and cravings and sleep, and all these sort of like universal wellness hub, if you will, or illness hub, depending on what's happening with you. And I really just wanted to show people a way out of that controlling their lives, and really get real about like, all the forms of failure that could activate and seize control over you and activate your habenula, and then habit formation and kind of what that does for, rewiring the brain, and then how to think about that with this new information involved. So it's basically the first layer of bringing this hard science into the public for translation. And I'm hoping that it's soon enough and fast enough to meet the moment that where our brains are going to collide with AI, are colliding with AI. And as AI improves exponentially in ways that we can't even fathom. And the way our brains work, we can't fathom what we can't fathom. We can't fathom that we can't fathom something, if that makes sense. Like it's really just like a blind spot for us. And so we have to say these words, but they're kind of meaningless. When I say we won't be able to fathom it, there's a disbelief, there's a skepticism, there's there's like a I know that comes in as a defense mechanism. in the brain so that we don't feel too groundless or too uncertain, which would be really hard for us to get on with our lives.
So for someone out there who wants to take action and they want to recover from potentially YouTube addiction or similar, Instagram, TikTok, what's a starting point? Would you recommend any specific practices, meditation? What would you say to them?
Well, I think, if 12-step programs aren't for you, then I think the other things are like harm reduction cycles. So, and also just like snitching on yourself. Like what you just did is you told me and everyone else who's listening that you have this problem.
It's true.
I did too. But I think that's brave because then everybody else is like, oh my gosh, I do too. Even they might be watching us or listening to us on YouTube. I don't know. So, we have to be compassionate towards ourselves, but very honest with ourselves and others because, in the dark grows the mold. So we have to just make that area nice and, bright and clean. And then what I did was I deleted my app because the app is super juiced to foster addiction.
Yeah.
And then I was left with my internal addiction cycles that I already had built in my brain, my internal wiring that I had built by consuming this app. I no longer needed the app. I was doing it to myself. I had checking disease. And then I started to go to the mobile web version. And thankfully, I don't get to like download anything on the mobile web version. I can just like only watch it in the mobile web. There's a picture in picture. So then I go to harm reduction on like when I'm going to do it. I'm only going to do it when I'm brushing my teeth and getting ready for bed, or I'm only going to do it this time, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I start time boxing it to reduce. And in the book, I go through like iterations and iterative mindset and how like I categorized every type of way that we humans iterate on a problem and solution on a problem. And so that model could help people to really kind of ideate and brainstorm different ways in which would work for them to do the YouTube thing. And now what I'm on is instead of using YouTube, I'm forcing myself to call somebody and just leave a message because I don't have I don't have an agreement that I was going to talk to you right now. I'm just trying. And then if I don't reach them, I'm just deliberately saying to them, like, I'm on purpose leaving you this message because I don't like where we are in social media where we have to pre-schedule everything and everything's at arm's length and I can't just call you. So I'm invoking, 1990s rules right now. So
I love that. We need more of that, really. Disrupt yourself. I mean, we get to a point where when I was young, if someone knocked on the door, it was kind of exciting. Like, who's going to be there? Now there's a feeling of dread, like, oh no, someone wants something from me and I'm not prepared because I've got all of these other things that are important. We need to shift that kind of mindset. Or someone calls you and you're like, oh, who calls me without texting first to see if it's okay to call? But if we spend less time on social media, we'll have more time for that to normalize again. Because I love your idea of that iterative process of reducing consumption. One simple way that I know would end my my fixation with YouTube, I don't know if it's an addiction, it might be, but it is to simply not pay for premium. If there are ads, I'm just not going to do it.
That's one I hadn't thought about. And that's in the iterates model, the A stands for adding something. So like you're adding friction.
Yeah.
Of like, your disgust or your impatience or your, whatever. I love that. That's a great idea.
Yeah. I hate ads more than I like watching nonsense on YouTube. Although I have to say that every now and then there are videos that I really want to deliberately watch from creators that I follow.
Absolutely.
Podcast interviews or so forth. But generally you could probably find them on Spotify. So maybe you don't really need that platform anymore. I know when I log on, it's just all about Israel and Palestine and this and that. And it's like, why would I start? I'm not saying I start my day with this, but why would I, have that influence so early on in the day? It's not natural and it doesn't really increase motivation.
No, it's being done to you
Yeah.
instead of by you. So it's non-consensual.
So awareness is really the key, and spreading the message is important, especially, I've got a workshop for parents of the kids at the school, just mentioning that it's worthwhile paying attention to I love the idea of these little tubules or wormholes that we find ourselves in. And this is happening to kids, whether they know it or not, if they've got access to these tools.
Mm.
Yeah. And we're training ourselves to get onto that cycle. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a challenging one to unravel.
I wonder if what inspires me as I hear, as I think about like what we just did with the YouTube thing, is if we come together, we're a lot smarter than if we're just trying to solve this alone.
Yes.
And so like almost having like a design thinking exercise around like all the parent wisdom, like what do you think would work, for this problem and that problem, and then how do we block this thing from happening as a secondary or a tertiary, like those kinds of things, because people really are super clever. I mean, that they're super clever and they can figure these things out if they come together.
Yeah. And we just collect the best of the best from all of these ideas
You
and come up with
upvote, you downvote, you try things. And
Yeah.
then the most key thing is iterating. Because of my research on what lasts, it's iteration. AI was born from iteration cycles. It was born from an accelerated number of iteration cycles. Anything that didn't iterate as fast as this AI did was killed off as a program. And the only ones that survived were the super iterators. So we have to meet this energy.
Mm-hmm. And then build the positive habits. I mean, there's the atomic habits approach. In my book, I talk about values-based habits, and it's iterative in terms of upscaling or increasing the habit. So, I'm a calm person, start with 1 long exhalation per day, and then I do 5, and then I do 10, and then eventually I'm meditating for an hour a day, if that lights me up. I mean, that's not for everyone, but that's a better way to create sustained change.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's not the best. I mean, that's the first phase, but inevitably, what Atomic Habits and my mentor was BJ Fogg, where James Clear got most of that stuff from Atomic Habits, and he had Tiny Habits as a book.
I've followed him for a while.
Yeah, he's a genius, and so that really works until it doesn't. It's kind of like growth mindset. It works until it does. If you don't have full coverage for neutralizing all kinds of failure in all kinds of forms, then you have a partial medicine that is eventually going to have a spot where it needs other coverage, kind of like an antibiotic. Like it only covers these bugs, but it doesn't cover those bugs. So iterative mindset, which is, and I'm not saying this to brag at all, but I just want people to know that like iteration in my research was the only common thread for keeping going, because it's impenetrable. Like you just keep iterating instead of failing, and that keeps your habenula at bay. That's the most important thing, and that's why I say like we're updating our thinking around addiction and also on habit formation, like what to focus on, because we have this new information and we just need to update our schemas. It's not that anybody was wrong. Those were all really amazing insights, and your work as well. But now it's time to extend it with this new data that's coming to us to be able to weave that in, and I'm sure that you can easily, apply that, I mean, you're already talking about iterations, but like, applying that in a way to make people completely fail safe,
That makes so much sense. So it's like, is it kind of like updating your firewall on your computer? You iteratively need to do that.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, because inevitably life does a pivot or it shifts or it disrupts you. And so this idea of like getting it right and building it up, it can all come crashing down, when you get injured or when somebody in your family gets sick or like those kinds of things. And then what happens is that then that becomes an indictment inside the head of, well, I used to be able to do an hour of meditation and now look at me, I can't do it. Failure, habenula, motivation tank. Like that's the loop we have to figure out how to hack now.
Amazing. Kyra, how can people connect with you, follow your work? Where would you like them to go?
Yeah, well, I have a website, drkyrabobinet.com. There is a quiz on there that's free and has, like, we don't sell your data, is literally like the work of a researcher like myself, trying to put good things in the world to measure your iterative mindset. And you can get your profile to kind of learn more about yourself and about, what to do to really improve your iteration in your life and how to change your behavior long term. And then my company is freshtry.com, TRI.com. We have a free software. Again, no ads, no selling of data. It's more of like a public health type of thing to help people form habits that don't hit their habenula, that don't hit their brain. My social channels are run by my team, Instagram and those kinds of things. So I am out there in that way, but I say use with caution. Like you said, we should follow very specific creators like yourself who are putting out really good things to be healthful and to be well.
Thank you so much. Any final thoughts for those who stuck with us all the way to the end?
You can't fail at this. You cannot fail at your life. You cannot fail. You didn't fail. You're just learning. And if you feel like a failure, you just haven't heard yet that that's a learning, and the gold is the learning, and that you can take that and apply it to the future. And you are never, ever a failure. I've never met a failure in my whole life.
Dr. Kyra, thank you so much. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Me too. Thank you so much, Brad.
See you all next time.